No insulation, no heating system, no backup plan. And yet, they survived. Not just for one winter, not just for two, but for decades, in conditions that would kill most modern men within hours. High in the Rocky Mountains, where winter doesn't arrive gently, it arrives like a sentence. Temperatures that drop to 40 below zero, blizzards that don't last a day or two, but rage for weeks without stopping, without softening, without mercy. And somewhere in the middle of all that darkness and cold, a man had to sleep, had to eat, had to stay alive until the storm decided it was done with him. What does it feel like to know the storm won't stop? And neither can you. That's not a question from a history book. That's the question every mountain man faced the moment the sky turned white and the wind began to scream. One poorly built shelter, one failed heating system, one miscalculation in the construction of a wall or a roof. And come spring, when other trappers finally made it out to check on remote camps, they wouldn't find a man. They'd find a body, frozen solid, still sitting by a fireplace that had gone cold long before the storm did. But here's what makes this story remarkable. The men who lived through those winters, season after season, hadn't survived by luck. They had built something. Shelter systems so sophisticated, so precisely engineered using nothing but trees, stones, and animal hides, that some of their techniques outperform modern emergency structures used today. How did they do it? And why? In an age where we can heat an entire building with the push of a button, have we forgotten what they knew? My name is Marcus. This is Primal Echoes, where ancient survival meets modern understanding. Between 1820 and 1880, mountain men endured some of the most extreme weather conditions ever recorded in North American history. What they built wasn't mythology. It was science, earned in blood, perfected through failure, and proven every single winter they stayed alive. Samuel Mackenzie had survived 17 Rocky Mountain winters. Not because he was the strongest man in the mountains, not because he was the luckiest. He survived because, when the sky turned dark and the barometric pressure began to drop, he didn't panic. He read the land. Standing in the howling wind, with a blizzard 12 hours out, Mackenzie wasn't looking at a map. He was reading the slope of the terrain, the way the trees bent, the direction the snow had drifted from previous storms. Every detail was information. And in the Rocky Mountains, information was the difference between a shelter that kept you alive and a grave you dug yourself. The mountain doesn't care about your intentions. It only responds to your decisions. And the first decision, the one that shaped every other choice that followed, was where you chose to stand. Mountain men understood that site selection wasn't a preference, it was engineering. South-facing slopes received maximum solar exposure through the short winter days, adding passive warmth that required no fire, no fuel, no effort. Valley bottoms were avoided entirely, not because they looked exposed, but because cold air is heavy. It sinks and settles, turning low terrain into natural cold traps that could drop temperatures 10 to 15 degrees colder than the surrounding hillside. Ridgelines were equally dangerous, exposed to wind loading that could tear apart even a well-built structure. The ideal location sat between those extremes, sheltered by natural terrain, protected by dense tree lines that deflected prevailing winds, yet elevated enough to drain cold air away rather than collect it. Choosing the right site alone could reduce a shelter's heating requirements by up to 60%. 60%. That's not a small detail. In a month-long blizzard, that number is the difference between having enough fuel and running out on day 19. What's striking is that mountain men weren't alone in this understanding. Hundreds of miles away, Native American tribes, with no contact, no shared tradition, were positioning their winter camps using the exact same principles. South-facing slopes, natural wind protection, elevated ground with drainage. Two entirely separate cultures, shaped by the same brutal teacher, the land itself. That's not coincidence. That's universal survival intelligence, written into the geography for anyone willing to read it. Once the site was chosen, construction began with the same precision. Lodgepole pine and Douglas fir were selected not by preference, but by performance. Their strength-to-weight ratio made them ideal for bearing the crushing snow loads that could reach 100 pounds per square foot on a Rocky Mountain roof. Stone foundations were built without mortar, carefully fitted so they could shift with freeze-thaw cycles without cracking or collapsing. Every log was seasoned, every joint designed to interlock under pressure rather than pull apart. The structure wasn't just built to stand, it was built to tighten as the storm bore down on it. But the shelter was only as good as what burned inside it. And building a fire that could keep a man alive through 40 below zero, that was its own science entirely. Thomas Whitaker fed another split log into his stone fireplace and watched the flames settle into the carefully positioned rocks surrounding the combustion chamber. Outside, the wind was screaming at 60 miles per hour. The temperature had dropped to 35 below zero. But inside his cabin, the air sat at a steady 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Not because Whitaker was burning more wood than anyone else, not because he had access to better materials, but because he understood something that most men never stopped long enough to learn: that fire is not survival. Fire is the beginning of survival. What you do with its heat, that's the real skill. The center of that skill was something modern architects now call thermal mass, a principle that sits at the heart of today's most advanced passive solar building designs. But mountain men were engineering it 200 years before it had a name. The concept is straightforward, but the execution required deep intuition. Stone absorbs heat slowly during active burning, storing thermal energy deep within its mass. Then, long after the fire dies down, when the wood is gone and the coals have faded to gray, the stone keeps radiating. A fireplace built correctly, with the right stone selection and the right chamber geometry, could continue releasing stored heat for 8 to 12 hours after the last flame went out. In a blizzard that lasted 3 weeks, that difference between a fire that heats and a system that holds heat could mean everything. Chimney construction was where most men made their most costly mistakes. Mountain men understood that a chimney wasn't just a pipe for smoke, it was a precision instrument. The angle of the draft, the height of the flue, the placement of the heat exchange zone where outgoing smoke passed close enough to warm incoming air. Every variable mattered. A chimney designed with proper draft angles and heat recovery geometry could increase overall heating efficiency by up to 40%. 40% more warmth from the same amount of wood. In a month where fuel was finite and the storm had no end date, that number wasn't just impressive, it was survival math. And survival math extended to every log stacked outside that door. Mountain men didn't guess at fuel consumption. They calculated it. They knew their burn rates across different weather conditions. They knew how temperature drops in the night affected consumption, and they built their fuel reserves accordingly. Enough seasoned wood to last through a month-long storm, with emergency reserves set aside for weather events that pushed beyond that. Nothing was left to assumption. Assumption was how men died. The wood itself was selected with the same precision. Hardwoods like oak and maple burned slow and hot, collapsing into long-lasting coals that sustained heat through the night without constant tending. Softwoods like pine ignited quickly and produced rapid, high heat, ideal for starting fires in extreme cold when speed mattered more than duration. Mountain men didn't choose one over the other. They used both, each for its specific role, the way a surgeon selects instruments, not interchangeably, but with precise purpose. Fire wasn't something they made, it was something they managed. And in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when the storm was at its worst and the fire had burned to low embers, that stone fireplace kept radiating its stored warmth into the dark. Not magic, physics. The same physics that kept Whitaker alive through another night at 35 below, and another after that, and another, until the storm finally broke and the mountains went quiet again. But heat alone couldn't save them. The shell around that heat had to be perfect, because even the most brilliant fire in the world is useless if the cold can reach right through your walls and take it. The Henderson family learned the most terrifying lesson of their first Rocky Mountain winter, not from the cold outside, but from the ice forming inside their cabin. The fire was burning. It had been burning all night, but their walls were leaking cold air in ways they couldn't see, and the moisture from their own breath, their cooking, their bodies, was freezing against the interior logs before it could escape. Ice on the inside walls, ice on the floor near the door. They nearly died not because they lacked fire, but because the shell around that fire was failing them silently, inch by inch, while they slept. That experience, and the near death of an entire family, is exactly what separated a beginner's cabin from a mountain man's survival system. The difference wasn't the fire. It was the wall. Log fitting was treated with the same precision as any load-bearing engineering. Logs were selected for consistent diameter, shaped along their joining surfaces with hand tools until the contact was tight enough to resist wind infiltration on its own. Then came chinking, a clay-based compound mixed with organic fibers, dried grass, animal hair, applied not in a single pass but in multiple layers, each one adding redundancy to the seal. Done correctly, a properly chinked log wall reduced air infiltration by up to 80%. The cabin didn't just feel warmer. Physically, thermodynamically, it became a different environment from the mountain outside its walls. The roof demanded the same layered thinking. Split wooden shingles laid first, then sheets of bark over those, then animal hides stretched and secured over the bark. 3 separate waterproof barriers working together, each one a backup for the one beneath it. The roof angle was calculated not for aesthetics, but for physics. Steep enough to shed snow before accumulation could threaten the structure, while still maintaining the insulating air pocket between the roof layers that slowed heat escape from inside. It was a system, not a surface. But the most sophisticated challenge wasn't the walls or the roof. It was the air itself. Mountain men understood a paradox that still sits at the center of modern building science. You need fresh air to survive, but every opening you create for ventilation is a door you've left open for the cold. Too little airflow, and carbon monoxide from the fire accumulates silently, killing sleeping men without a sound. Too much airflow, and the heating system can't keep pace with the heat loss. The solution was adjustable ventilation openings, small and precisely positioned, that could be widened or narrowed based on fire intensity, storm severity, and occupant need. Managing the air inside that cabin wasn't a comfort decision. It was a life-or-death calculation made multiple times every day. The door system carried that same philosophy into every entry and exit. Mountain men built double barrier door systems, an outer door and an inner door with a small enclosed space between them, what we would now call an airlock. When a man came in from outside, he entered the first door, closed it behind him, then opened the second. The pocket of cold air he brought with him never reached the living space. The heat inside never rushed out to meet the storm. It sounds simple, but in 40 below conditions, that airlock was preserving hours of carefully generated warmth with every single use. What's remarkable is that thousands of miles north, the Athabascan people of Alaska had developed chinking techniques using the same clay and fiber composite, the same layered application method, with no contact, no shared knowledge, no common tradition with the mountain men of the Rockies. 2 entirely separate cultures, shaped by entirely different landscapes, arriving at the exact same answer, which raises a question worth sitting with. How much of what we call innovation is really just rediscovering what survival already taught someone else? The mountain had been giving the same lesson for centuries. The ones who lived were simply the ones who listened. On the 3rd day of the blizzard of 1856, Martha Caldwell heard the chimney collapse. Not crack, not shift, collapse. The weight of accumulated snow and ice bringing the entire structure down in a single moment, taking the primary heating system of her family's cabin with it. Her husband was out on the trap line and hadn't made it back. The storm had no intention of stopping, and Martha had 6 children, a failing shelter, and no one coming to help her. What happened next wasn't luck. It wasn't instinct. It was protocol. Emergency knowledge passed down from veteran mountain men who understood that every system eventually fails and that survival belongs to whoever has already planned for that moment. The first priority was heat conservation, not heat generation. Martha pulled her children into the smallest interior room, hung animal hides across the doorway to shrink the space that needed to stay warm, and layered every piece of clothing and bedding they owned into a shared sleeping arrangement that combined 6 small bodies into a single heat source. She located the emergency fuel stored inside the cabin, seasoned wood kept dry specifically for situations when outdoor access was impossible, and began burning it slowly, carefully, rationing each piece against the unknown length of the storm. She melted snow for water over a small interior fire, found the dried meat and preserved stores that had been set aside for exactly this kind of extended emergency. And she kept her children calm by keeping herself calm. That last part, the psychological discipline to project steadiness when fear was the most available emotion. That was its own survival technique, and mountain men who had endured months of winter isolation understood it as clearly as they understood timber loads and chimney angles. Panic was a faster killer than cold. Routine was the antidote. Martha established one, and she held to it, hour by hour, until the storm broke on day 6, and the world outside went quiet again. As veteran mountain man Jeremiah Collins wrote in 1887, "A man's shelter is his life in the mountains. Build it right, and it will keep you warm through the worst storms nature can send. Build it wrong, and it becomes your tomb." But what Collins understood, and what Martha Caldwell proved without ever writing a single word, is that the shelter is only half the equation. The other half is the person inside it. Their knowledge, their discipline, their refusal to stop thinking clearly when everything around them is breaking down. We've built cities. We've built systems, networks, technologies that can heat a building from a phone in our pocket. But have we built the one thing they had? The ability to survive when all those systems fail at once. The mountain men of the Rocky Mountains didn't have the luxury of that question. They lived the answer every single winter, and they paid for every piece of that knowledge in cold and exhaustion and loss. That knowledge didn't disappear. It's waiting. And it turns out, the mountain men weren't the only ones who found it. Across the Atlantic, in the brutal winters of Scandinavia, the Vikings were solving the same problem, with different materials, different structures, and engineering decisions that would shape how entire civilizations survived the cold for centuries. That story is next. My name is Marcus. This is Primal Echoes, because the answers we need today were already earned in blood, long before us.